Support for Trifles comes from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/trifles and at trifles.substack.com. And now you can enjoy some Trifles swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers, available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 472, Professor Moriarty. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the podcast where we talk about the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you feeling professorial today?
I profess to be so occasionally, but not particularly today. I feel, I don't know, freshman-like. Sort of undergraduate. I feel very undergraduate.
Undergraduate?
Yeah, undergraduate.
Well, did you know that you can tell a freshman by his slap-happy look, and you can tell a sophomore because he carries a comic book. You can tell a junior by his debonair and such. You can tell a senior, but you can't tell him much.
And who wrote that?
I don't know. I remember that from some joke book I had when I was in grade school.
Oh, that's pretty funny. That's nice. Not quite Ogden Nash quality, but okay. Yeah.
Not quite.
Yeah.
But of that era, I think.
Yeah,
well, we are of the era when we are going back to school. I actually sent both my sons back to their second semester of college. Well, not of college, but their second semester of the year today. So it seems appropriate for us to be recording this about, oh my goodness, Professor Moriarty. How did we get this far without talking about Professor Moriarty? That's a rhetorical question. We learned all about rhetoric during the BSI weekend. But I should mention that we did talk tangentially about Moriarty. We talked about his mathematics in episode 219, and we talked about his brothers, the three brothers Moriarty, in episode 213. But that was 5 years ago, and we realized we haven't talked at all about the professor himself. So stay tuned, because this is going to be all about Professor James Moriarty. We'd like to remind you and invite you to support the show. The more of you reach out to us and tell us that you love what we do, the more we want to steer you to our payment system. Yes, it is Patreon or Substack. Both options are there for as little as $1 a month. You can say that you are a producer of not of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, that's a separate thing, of Trifles. And that is that you get to say that you support what we do here. That means you believe in what we do. It means you want to help us continue to do what we do. And having just come off of the Baker Street Irregulars weekend in New York, we heard from so many of you. You came up to us. You told us what the show means to you. And we were thrilled to hear that. If you are in a position to help support us, we would welcome that. So just go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. And of course, sign up to get our updates on email at sherlockholmespodcast.com. Any way that you can be regularly notified about what we do, that'll help you listen to us on the regular. And I suppose on the irregular. Okay, we find ourselves in the lair of Professor Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime. Why don't we first talk about what inspired this particular subject choice, Bert?
Well, what inspired it on my behalf was Les Klinger. And we both spent some time with Les during this most recent Baker Street Irregulars weekend. But he's written so much in the world of Sherlock Holmes and annotated so much that we decided to find a good essay. Well, all of Les's essays are good, but good for trifles, something that'll give you some insight into Les and his background. And for those of our listeners who don't know, the shorthand story about Les is that he discovered Sherlock Holmes back in 1968 when he was a second-year law student and never did very much. He acquired some books, and then in 1976, he wound up in possession of a Sherlockian library, and then he began writing in the 1990s and then annotating Sherlock Holmes. And this is an essay that I don't recall exact. Oh, he says he had written this and it appeared in Holmes versus Moriarty, which was published by Dynamite Entertainment in 2012. And he does not have a copy of that title. And it's really a lovely little piece, and we thought we would share it with you today.
Yeah, and less than being a review of a particular piece of Sherlockian scholarship, it's really more of an inspiration for what we're going to talk about today, because we've never done a profile of Professor Moriarty, and I think Les's piece reminded us about exactly how much, or more importantly, how little we actually know about Professor Moriarty, beginning with the fact that even though he is considered Sherlock Holmes's arch nemesis, and I suppose that's what a face-off on the Reichenbach Falls will do to you, he only appeared in 3 stories. If you had to name the 3 stories off the top of your head, dear listener, do you think you could? Well, of course, there's The Final Problem, and of course, there's the coda to that, which appears in The Empty House, where Holmes reappears. And really, Moriarty is more of a flashback than anything, but he is mentioned by name in The Empty House. And then, of course, the third is in The Valley of Fear, which was published after The Final Problem and The Empty House, but chronologically, obviously, it took place before the events in The Final Problem. So those are the only 3 places we come across Professor Moriarty, as mentioned by name.
Well, as mentioned by name, and as Les points out, the reader of these 3 stories never has an opportunity to actually observe Moriarty. Everything we know about Moriarty is in the third person, or more distantly, Holmes is telling Watson, and Watson is telling us.
That is true. And when you think about just about every interpretation of Sherlock Holmes, particularly on screen, in popular culture, I don't think we ever have an instance of Dr. Watson meeting Professor Moriarty.
No, Watson catches a glimpse in The Final Problem. Watson catches a glimpse of a tall man after Holmes points out that Moriarty is following them. And subsequently, Watson sees a black figure of a man whom he later concludes was Moriarty. Watson must rely totally on Holmes's word that Moriarty exists and is a threat. And again, in The Empty House, the professor is long gone, and Watson again must rely completely on Holmes's word that Moriarty was involved in their adventure.
Yeah. But, when you consider the Valley of Fear, we find out that Inspector MacDonald met the professor, and he called him a very respectable man. So, of course, Holmes is basically saying that, well, he's got to have some kind of illicit income, that allows him to be the Napoleon of crime. But there's no direct confrontation, no direct appearance of Moriarty in front of Holmes and Watson. So you could make the case, and I think some authors and some scholars over the years have done so, that Moriarty could have simply been a figment of Holmes's active imagination. But
Or worse, his addiction to drugs, which is what Nick Meyer gave us in the 7% Solution.
Correct. But let's talk about what we do know about Professor Moriarty. Well, he existed. Well, at least in the Sherlock Holmes canon, he existed. He had two brothers, right? We know that. We covered that in episode 213, both named James. We knew he was a mathematics genius. Okay. But let's track back and remember what Holmes does say about him. He's the greatest schemer of all time, the organizer of every deviltry, the controlling brain of the underworld, a brain which might have made or marred the destiny of nations. That's the man. He sits motionless like a spider in the center of its web, but that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows well every quiver of each of them. He does little himself. He only plans. But his agents are numerous and splendidly organized. If there's a crime to be done, a paper to be abstracted, we'll say a house to be rifled, a man to be removed, the word is passed to the professor and the matter organized and carried out. The agent may be caught. In that case, the money's found for his bail or his defense, but the central power which uses the agent is never caught, never so much as suspected. This is what Holmes tells us in the Valley of Fear about the professor.
And if Holmes is to be believed, and Holmes's honesty and truth-telling is, for the most part, completely adopted by anyone who's seriously delving into the canon. If Holmes is to be believed, then when they meet in the final problem, Moriarty complains, after consulting his memorandum book, "You crossed my path on the 4th of January. On the 23rd, you incommoded me. By the middle of February, I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March, I was absolutely hampered in my plans, and now, at the close of April, I find myself placed in such a position through your continual persecution that I am in positive danger of losing my liberty." Now, while we can't match the dates noted by Moriarty to precise cases, we can deduce that Holmes and Moriarty have in fact crossed paths previously, perhaps even on some occasions when Holmes was unaware of Moriarty's existence.
Well, I think that's a good point when you think about the Valley of Fear, which, as I said before, obviously had to take place before the final problem, before the Reichenbach Falls. In that story, we get a ripple of Moriarty, but it seems that he's helping out other criminals. So it stands to reason that if you consider the canon at large, Moriarty could very well have been assisting other criminals along the way. And even consider from a dramatic perspective, a dramatization perspective, how cleverly it was done in the Granada series with Jeremy Brett, when I believe the Red-Headed League was the last story before the final problem. And there you had it was the French gold that was being pilfered. and Moriarty was seen to be behind the Red-Headed League and was trying to sell the stolen Mona Lisa at the same, or obviously copies of the Mona Lisa at the same time. So it was cleverly woven in. And I think in the final problem, he even mentioned the issue of the French gold, which Holmes tied to the Red-Headed League. So all that being said, Moriarty could have had an influence behind any number of other crimes that Sherlock Holmes had been investigating along the way.
And Les, in his essay, points out several examples of prior cases where Moriarty could have featured, going all the way back to Study in Scarlet, where Les reminds us it's 1881, Jefferson Hope has come to London. He's trying to track down Joseph Stangerson and Enoch Drebber. He enlists the aid of a young man who helps him by means of a clever disguise as an old woman who will retrieve the ring of his betrothed from Holmes. And many people over the years have speculated about the identity of that old woman. We never find out anything at all about who that really was.
Think that was Moriarty?
Yeah, well, it could have. It could have been. It could have been. Yeah. Well, I have to check his ears or his forehead. But the question is, here's this American coming to London. Where could he find such an accomplice? And how did he locate Stangerson and Drebber? So it's logical in some sense that upon arriving in London, Hope learned of a vast organization that could be put to work on his problems. Maybe it was a chance acquaintance. Maybe it was a fellow cab driver who put him onto it. In any event, it's some cause, but it's likely that Hope was tipped to the way things went in London and sought help from the Moriarty organization. He couldn't afford to engage the organization to do his hunting for him, but he might have scraped up sufficient funds to pay for a tip or two, to engage the services of the young man to make a quick, riskless appearance at Baker Street, and so on. And so there was perhaps maybe even the earliest appearance of the Moriarty organization.
Yeah. Yeah, and Les goes on to mention a couple of other stories, but let's skip ahead to, and this is an interesting one. As we've come off of season 9, when we talked about the Apocrypha of Sherlock Holmes, the Lost Special. Remember, that was the story of the train that went missing, and Les thinks that, well, maybe it's possible that Moriarty was involved in this. He said it's a tantalizing story. It may or may not have come from Watson's own pen. But, of course, we know, as reported in that story, that there was an amateur reasoner of some celebrity that was a recognized authority on such matters. And lots of people thought that was Sherlock Holmes. But what makes the story of interest is the central villain, Henri de Lernac, described as the author of a story, as the author of the story, as an arch criminal. And he's clearly not Moriarty, right? He's French. He wasn't captured until about 1897. But it's interesting to read the suggestions of the amateur reasoner that there may be an English Camorra, an underworld organization capable of conducting the theft of an entire railroad train. So, if the events took place in 1890, the amateur reasoner probably wrote to the press thereafter, and the case may well have taken place in those months leading up to the final problem, when Moriarty was ticking off all of those dates.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's really useful to think that there was appearance by the professor and the professor's organization in the earlier cases. And, the logical extension of thinking like that is, well, wait a minute now. Holmes escaped Reichenbach. So maybe Moriarty escaped Reichenbach too. And it's a great idea to imagine that, today you look around and there does seem to be a great amount of evil in the world, as there always is. I frequently remark it's a wicked world, which is not a unique individual observation, I don't think. But it's a nice idea to think that perhaps Moriarty lives and is personally responsible for the horrors of the 20th and even the 21st century. And,
Wow.
Where Les takes us is, we know that the implacable Sherlock Holmes will eventually bring about his downfall because, as you might recall, there's a conversation Holmes has in the Valley of Fear where he says pretty much that.
Well, I happen to know that it's impossible that Moriarty survived into the 21st century. And it's not for the reason you're thinking. It's simply this.
Yes.
He was a diabetic. And the reason that we know he was a diabetic is because his favorite dessert was trifles.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You evidently don't know me.
On the contrary, I think it's fairly evident that I do. I can spare you 5 minutes, if you have anything to say.